Love podcasts, hate nonsense. It's the PoliticsJOE podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
I've finally said it, so there's no grey area for me on that anymore. We are joined by Mathew Lawrence from Commonwealth. How are you?
Pleasure. And I hear it's your first sort of hosting, your sort of central.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
Auspicious day.
And we're with Seán Hickey as well. How are you, Seán?
Yes, we are. I'm fantastic. Congratulations on your first clarification that you're not a nonce lover.
Yeah, glad we cleared that up. Mathew, you are from Commonwealth. How would you describe what Commonwealth is?
So Commonwealth is a think tank that focuses on how our economy is owned and with what consequences. So it really digs into sort of when you're paying your water bills, who actually owns Thames Water? When you're sort of paying your electricity bills, where is that money going to? How has privatisation transformed our landscape? And how could a new era of public ownership, but not just public ownership, worker ownership, employee ownership, a different way of owning and governing our economy, better benefit ordinary people and communities?
What a great day to have you on, given the overnight news that the Treasury and DESNZ have announced that the government plans to increase its investment in Sizewell C, the nuclear power plant in Suffolk, by 14.2 billion over the next 3 years. Can you tell us what you know about that and where and who that money is going to?
So firstly, it is a significant day. This is a major large-scale investment and will be one of the largest nuclear sort of new initiatives for a generation. And the money, just over 14 billion direct investment into Sizewell, will be, as far as I understand, direct equity investment. So there'll be kind of co-ownership stake in partnership with EDF, which is a major French-owned sort of energy utility, and a number of other investors. The exact mix is still a little unclear. Alongside that, there's been an announcement that there'll be sort of public investment going into SMRs, so small modular reactors, which you might have heard of. Sort of a lot of the AI companies are particularly interested in it. They're sort of smaller scale, as the name would suggest, and there's a lot of hope resting on them in some of the energy sector. That will be in partnership with Rolls-Royce, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But it's definitely a significant day. I think the fact that the money, there's an equity stake, so the public will have a stake in this rather than it just being sort of cash that will be diverted to shareholders, I think is significant. The challenge now is to make sure that what we see at Sizewell C is not replicating what we've seen in other nuclear projects, which is delay, waste, overrun. And I think that's always the risk with nuclear. These are very large scale projects lasting multiple decades in which cost overrun is often, sort of baked in. And so I think that will be the challenge. Can we actually get value for money in a safe, secure way? Because if so, I think this will be a sort of significant day.
Because that's the sort of thing that seems to hang over like the public and popular imagination of nuclear is the waste. How do you dispose of it? It feels like a scarier form of energy than other forms of energy. I mean, how do you think, Seán, the public are going to take the news about Sizewell C, given that kind of psychological feeling about it?
I don't know. I mean, it seems that the public conversation has probably moved on in the last 15, 20 years on nuclear, right? It was kind of this scare in the early 2000s and 2010s to some extent from accidents like Chernobyl in the past, right? But I think the longer the energy mix and the kind of conversation about environment and whatever it might be is focused on how reliant we are on things like oil and gas, almost entirely owned by private companies. I think there's maybe a level of desperation in the public that they're like, well, you know what, we need to start. We should have been investing in this 20 years ago, right? To be at a point where it's a viable part of our electricity mix. So yeah, maybe we have moved on.
Because it's interesting that it's with EDF, which is like the French, I think it's state-owned company, because France have a lot of nuclear energy. Is this sort of partnership and investment between the government and private companies, and the equity stake, like you mentioned, is that the model that Commonwealth would like to see more of from the government when it comes to energy ownership, or do you think there is an alternative or better model?
Yeah, I mean, I think on nuclear in France, just an aside, there's a great book called, I think, The Radiant Age, which is all about kind of how, in a very French way, kind of the massive nuclear build out in the 70s was not just like an energy program, but it was a kind of very French way of defining its sense of like modernity and technology and future. And I think nuclear has always been wrapped up in that, maybe a little less than it used to be, but nuclear's always had this kind of over and above just an energy source, is a sense of like, man's Promethean ability to sort of manipulate nature and unleash power. And the French, in a very French way, really mastered that. So anyway, that's a good book. On the question, I think EDF actually speaks to sort of a number of benefits around public ownership. So our preference is not really sort of public-private, PFI style deals in which the public is like held over a barrel and rent is extracted from them. Instead, we argue for a sort of coherent, publicly owned energy system based on three real reasons. So what we all want is a kind of secure, clean, low-cost energy system in which households and businesses, are not being sort of relentlessly squeezed by costs. So the question is, how do you deliver that? How do you organize the investment pipeline, so the actual investment in new kit, in new grids, in new wind farms to actually deliver that? And public ownership, so the idea of a publicly owned company organizing that, has three benefits. One, cost. So the cost of public investment is significantly lower than private investment. So if the government borrows to invest in new infrastructure, that is lower than, say, a private equity firm borrowing to do the same investment. And critically, renewables, the business model of renewables is all about upfront investment. The wind is free, so the main cost for building out a renewable sort of system is that upfront investment. So the sort of lower the cost of capital, the bigger the savings for build players down the line. The second is sort of coherence. So what privatization has done is fragmented the system. It's sliced it and diced it and sort of made it very incoherent and very uncoordinated. But of course, an energy system is a system. And actually, public ownership allows you to sort of plan, to integrate, to coordinate, and to cohere investment. So you're not sort of investing in a wind farm over here, but not investing in the grid because National Grid is privatized and it's not speaking to this company. And you can actually plan and cohere that investment pipeline. And the third thing is certainty. So we know with sort of existential sort of certainty, if we don't decarbonize, which speaks to your point about nuclear, if we don't decarbonize, there are much greater threats than kind of nuclear waste potentially, accelerating an already existing climate breakdown, but getting worse and worse. But at the moment, what we're seeing, and we've seen it in the last few months in the UK, where private energy companies, quite reasonably have said, we're not going to invest in this project because it doesn't clear a hurdle rate, an internal hurdle rate. So that's basically a judgment of like, this project needs to clear a certain amount of profitability for it to go ahead. Now, the private sector often has much higher hurdle rates than the public sector because their goal is to maximize profits completely reasonably, whereas the public sector can prioritize different things. So the publicly owned company can, like EDF, can invest with certainty. It can say, what we need is X gigawatts of clean power by 2030. We're going to invest to deliver that. Not what we need is to make X amount of money by 2030. Is investing in this energy infrastructure the best way to deliver that? And so, we've seen a whole host of projects because of elevated cost of capital, because of global volatility, sort of supply chain crunches, etc. We've seen in a sort of range of parts of the energy sector over the last few months, that uncertainty creeping in, the slowing down of investment exactly when we need to accelerate. And so that cost, coherence, and certainty benefit is why public ownership, public investment, and public planning for a coherent and coordinated system is the best way to deliver cheaper long-term bills and decarbonize the grid.
I think you hinted there at like a direction we want to go now in a second, which is the water industry. But before we go there, I'd like to it's been whirling around in my head for the last maybe 2-3 years of the public companies of other countries invested in Britain's public infrastructure. So whether it's trains, whether it's as we're talking about now with nuclear, this kind of, they operate as private entities for maximizing profit in this country, but ultimately their goal is to maintain low prices in, I'm thinking of, say, Trenitalia or Veolia or whatever it might be, maintaining low prices in their countries by subsidizing it by having extortionate prices in the UK. And I think of, so you remember when GB Energy was first announced in, I think it was 2022, and the idea was that it was going to be this entirely publicly run, publicly owned infrastructure project for the next 5-10 years to completely revolutionize Britain's grid. And as time went on, it became like an umbrella company for people like Shell and BP to go in and get a grant from to kind of diversify their mix. Where does Commonwealth kind of sit on how GB Energy exists as a company now and what it could have been when it was first proposed?
So it's very interesting that Commonwealth first proposed this idea of a publicly owned energy company that then sort of turned into GB Energy. I think we will have a bit more clarity, and viewers might already know this, when the spending review comes out on Wednesday. So that will kind of, I think, allocate some of the money. I think there's still potential in it. I think, there are different wings within the government, I think, sort of fighting over what exactly its role is. Is it a kind of vehicle for de-risking BP and Shell, as you say? Is it a company that sort of co-invests with communities? So you might have seen some of these announcements of GB Energy supporting solar panels on the NHS and councils, which I think is a really interesting version. Or will it, begin going incrementally and not quickly enough, but I think, interestingly and hopefully positively, down a path of investment in large-scale renewable or clean energy projects that are majority owned by GB Energy and will leverage its capital to deliver publicly owned power. Now, I think that would be just the start of a journey. It needs much greater investment firepower, much greater strategic autonomy and ability to pursue investments at scale over the next, not just 5 years, but next 15, 20 years if we want it to become an EDF. So I think it's a long way from that. I think there is still potential there, and I think it's partly, it's one of their most popular policies. I think partly because it's still a little ill-defined in the public imagination, but I think pressure to cleave to the original vision, something that's publicly owned by the public, for the public, I think that is, what will keep it on the kind of better path.
I think before we move on to water, it's Commonwealth released a report, I think it was called Tale of Two Cities or Tale of Two Towns.
That was Dickens. He was dead.
That guy, right?
Yeah. Next time.
And it was kind of focusing on how ex-industrial towns have been shaped by the policies that came into play there once the industry closed down and left. And these have been quite neoliberal policies that have allowed companies like Amazon to come in and really exploit those policies, and it ends up with low-paid jobs in the towns. And I think what's interesting is yesterday we saw Nigel Farage in Port Talbot, which has just been decommissioned by Tata Steel. The blast furnaces have closed, and he was there really making an appeal to people in the town, workers who have lost their jobs, that reform is the answer here. And he was saying that he would turn the blast furnace back on, which is near impossible, I believe, to do.
Well, also he was warning that when he was up in Scunthorpe, wasn't he, that once they're gone, they're gone. Like, they can't go back on. And then he's in Port Talbot saying, no, but we can do it here, though.
But the way he's going to these towns and kind of placing himself as like a man of the union and making an appeal to these former devoted Labour voters. I mean, what do you see as reform's role being in these ex-industrial towns?
Yeah, it's a really big and important question. I think the report you mentioned, A Tale of Two Towns, which really focuses on Mansfield in particular, which historically was both a big sort of mining community in Nottinghamshire, but also large-scale employment in the garment industry, both of which industries have basically entirely gone. The report by my colleague Sasha Hillhorst, her research is brilliant. I really recommend the report. I think there are three takeaways from that speaks to this question of why are reform doing really well, and I think I think his false arguments will nonetheless really land in many ways in South Wales and other parts of the country. So I think there are three things. One, the centrality of the idea of political corruption as an organizing view of politics. So what really comes across in Sasha's research is this idea that people think Westminster and all political parties are essentially corrupt in it for themselves on the take. Often unfairly, but nonetheless, that is a sort of pervasive view, which is a real problem for the left, which thinks that collective politics is the vehicle for sort of social transformation and emancipation. But I think it speaks to Farage's appeal because in some ways, going right back to UKIP, the sort of message has been Westminster's corrupt. We need political renewal. We're going to do big constitutional reform. Brexit was constitutional reform, and we're going to blow up the system. And so I think partly it speaks to that. The second is, as you mentioned, many of these communities that Farage is trying to appeal to in towns and places, there's this kind of sense that they've been left behind, that they are kind of, falling off the wagon of history, that they're kind of, oh God, this is a bit awkward. Don't look too deeply what's happened here. Whereas actually what the research shows is actually that absolutely the frontier of economic governance and new innovations. So whether it was privatization in the 80s, whether it was some of the sort of new models of workfare in the 90s under New Labour, Brexit itself, levelling up. But then I think in particular, as you say, like the fact that now in and around Mansfield, there are these huge Amazon warehouses with deeply precarious work. That is, and the town centres are hollowed out. This is not by the chance. This is because we have gutted labour laws and trade union rights, and we've pursued austerity. And so in a way, I think there's this sense that, like, actually these towns have not been left behind. They've been actively made and remade by radical economic governance. And people feel that, and they feel the anger of being subject to these experiments in which their lives have been made harder and worse. And they're looking for politics, despite the sort of first point, looking for someone to say, like, enough. And Farage does say, like, enough in his own way, albeit in a sort of deeply reactionary way. He does say, like, something needs to change. I think the third thing, which again, taps into why he was appealing to trade union members and kind of, people who've been working at the steelworks, is that, again, I think sometimes, maybe this is being unfair, but I think sometimes there's this view of ex-industrial, not just England, ex-industrial Britain, of, oh God, these people are deeply reactionary, like we've got to appease them with, like, appeals to really reactionary politics. Whereas I think what Sasha has found, and her work is based on sort of ethnographic research, living there, living and sort of speaking to people over the course of her research, is that actually there are these deep seams of solidarity, of solidaristic politics, of a sense of commonality, of pride in place, in sort of a belief in a common life that can be made better. And actually, if that can be tapped into, there's, I think, a real resonance for a much more solidaristic politics, that says, actually, we're going to focus on fixing economic insecurity. We're going to focus on fixing place. We're going to focus on fixing pride, not in a kind of like shallow sense, but actually like this is where you live. And I think, if you go to somewhere like Port Talbot, it was once one of the most, important industrial sites in the Western world, and therefore at the time probably one of the most important industrial sites in the world. And people know that, and they can feel the decline. And so I think what Farage taps into is this reactionary nostalgia and a sense that something has gone wrong. And I think those sentiments are not wrong. I think people are deeply tired. There's this sort of line by Arthur Miller, the playwright, the American playwright, who said, like, an era can be said to come to an end when its basic illusions are exhausted. And I think that's essentially where we are. People are exhausted. They are tired. They are tired of an economy that doesn't work for them. They're tired of a politics that doesn't seem to respond to that exhaustion. They're tired of just not being able to make ends meet, or bills going up, or water bills going up, but sort of services going down. And the illusions that, like, the two-party system can just kind of ride its way through that. The illusion that, like, we can just keep going on our growth model. The illusion that we can just, ignore climate change, which is just like ramifying through everything we do. The illusion we can just keep going, I think, is shattered. And I think into that space is where Farage inserts himself. And I think unless kind of progressives and the sort of wider left can kind of offer a sort of counter story, then the illusion will continue to grow and eventually burst.
It's the interesting difference. Sorry, go ahead.
When I was reading about Mansfield and how in your report you're saying that it's being dominated by now two industries, one of which is Amazon and the other of which is social care. I grew up in Dunfermline, which is like, so it's in Fife, like very ex-mining, and that like Dunfermline is dominated by those two industries as well. Just like a huge Amazon warehouse right in the center of it, lots of people employed in the social care sector as well. And I wondered if, and right up the road as well is Grangemouth, which has just been closed, or massive job cuts there. And Labour's solution there is to put in a green free port. And then obviously you went to Redcar as well, which is the same thing. Industry shut down and the government then put in a free port. And I wondered do you think that the Labour government right now is at risk of carrying on those illusions you mentioned, because their solution to deindustrialization seems to be just to put in free ports?
Yeah, a bunch of things. I think, first of all, deindustrialization is accelerating. So you might have seen some statistics about like output from heavy industry in the UK, and kind of whether it's petrochemicals, ceramics, Grangemouth. It's precipitously declining, and there are some structural reasons for that. It goes back in a part to the energy system. The UK's industrial energy prices are very high, partly because we're excessively reliant on gas, which sets the price and sets it at a high price, but also because we have liberalised and privatised the energy system. So we've shifted away from an old, industrial energy pricing model, which actually kept prices relatively low. So there's a bunch of reasons there that really have to be fixed as sort of the first step. And second, I think, to be fair to the Labour government, they have attempted in different ways to address this. So they are trying to do something on industrial strategy, which will come out later in the summer, which will include focus on how you make these sectors more viable, and that will include action on industrial energy prices. We await the details. They've also sort of put in some money into direct Grangemouth in a kind of transition plan. They had the sort of steel deal, but again, too late for Port Talbot. But I do think politically, you've just listed some of them: Port Talbot, Redcar, Grangemouth, these like iconic sites of British industry. They're just like falling like dominoes. In a way, this is not the Labour government's fault. They're just like the music stopped while they're in power, so to speak. These are sort of deep structural reasons. But I think you're right that a failure to act with scale and almost like doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that is it risks kind of the worst of all worlds. So I think the industrial strategy will be an important moment for the future of industry in the UK, industrial energy prices. But yeah, I mean, obviously a world in which you replace unionized industrial high productivity jobs with precarious casualized work, etc., is not not a good world, but nor is it a politically viable world. I think for Labour, and you saw in Scotland the sort of Scottish parliamentary election last week, in which Reform did pretty well, and I think that is an indication of what might be coming. And sometimes the kind of historical contradictions and kind of evolution is a bit too on the nose. Like, I think the Amazon warehouse is literally on the site of one of the old pits in Mansfield, and social care, which is a huge employer. And again, to be fair to the government, they're trying to introduce collective bargaining into the adult social care sector. So this idea that trade unions will bargain on behalf of all workers and to set the terms and conditions and hopefully elevate it. In the UK, we've shifted from a model of broadly public provision into very privatised provision over the last 30 or so years, including the sort of four largest adult social care providers being dominated by private equity, which inserts logics which I think most normal people say this is a deeply strange way to organise care, which is the most intimate form of human interaction in a way, to insert logics of asset inflation, asset stripping, rapid exit, profit making. I think most people would say that's a very strange way to organise that. And actually, can we think about better ways of organising social care, which is going to remain a big employer, not just in Mansfield, but across the country as we have an ageing population. So I think it's like all these things that needs these deeper resets, whether it's industry, whether it's the care sector. And the question is, if Labour don't step up, both what is the consequence for the public, but what is the downstream effects on our politics?
My point was on the free ports as well, actually. So there's not really anything really for me to add. But I think what you're saying there about it kind of speaks to this, not just privatization as an economic strategy, but also an exercise in changing the culture and psychology of places. How, as you're talking about care, kind of this transformation at how we look at the bottom lines of what is delivered from care and what the function of care is in the first place. But also in places that have free ports, such like your Grangemouths, your Redcars and places, over the course of a generation, places being a environment where the town is centralized around one industry. The town has kind of this symbiotic collective solidarity with one another, and everyone functions within everyone else's family circles, everyone else's social circles. To then have the alternative to that kind of industry and environment to be, well, we're going to put an economic grey zone a couple of a couple of kilometers down the road, and you can or cannot work there, but you're not going to be in a union. You're not going to have the opportunity for collective bargaining. You're not going to have the opportunity to kind of move your way up in a ladder, and see like how if you have family members who stay in those places and then end up working there, whether if it's an Amazon warehouse or whatever it might be, I can't imagine what it must feel like to have had generations upon generations of one's family working in one industry and living a good life, to then in the course of 30 years have that flipped on its head, and you work in precarious work, you piss in a bottle so you maximize shareholder value. It's a bizarre environment for anyone to work in, and the fact that this is kind of seen as a remedy to a decline in the kind of economic activity of a country is quite scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly that. I think the sense of loss, many of these towns, as you say, will have civic associations, built architecture that's literally embodied, those, single town industries, mining in Mansfield most obviously is part of this discussion. And, you walk through those high streets and you're visibly reminded of loss. And loss is a very powerful emotion, and it obviously can be transformed into either sort of, progressive sort of instincts, but it also can be transformed to really reactionary politics. And I think clearly, this reliance on low-paid, insecure work and attracting foreign, direct investment in the form of an Amazon warehouse, that isn't really an economic strategy to revive place, and place is so fundamental to politics. Really that, we'll see in the spending review, but fundamentally that does require like investment in, transport, in housing, in infrastructure, in giving, restoring, ending the austerity that local government has been struggling under for over a decade now, that then manifests in places that are run down and feel like they just have seen better days, and also seen better days when they know that parts of the country are doing pretty well, and that sort of obviously rubs the sore in a really sort of aggressive way. So I think it's not. I don't think we can go back to like a one industry town sort of type of economy. Nor do we necessarily want to, but I think we can start with, I guess, what those towns, and those industries offered, which is difficult and often dangerous and hard work, but that sense of community, place, solidarity. But that has to start with, making sure every household is secure, economically, socially, in all the dimensions of security, secure. This Parliament, after housing costs, we're on course to have the first recorded decline in living standards, according to JRF, the sort of anti-poverty charity. And that is just untenable. So it has to start with like putting more money in the pockets of households, whether that's through sort of redistribution through the tax and sort of spend system, or by reforming things like the energy sector to take money that is currently going to shareholders and redistribute it to households. So it has to really start with that, because when you have secure households, that's when you have thriving local economies. Because people have more money to spend in their high streets, they have more money to sort of spend in the area, and that sort of generates sort of virtuous circle. But it also requires, tackling, who actually owns the high street, who are these like, sort of absent landlords, absent tenants, who are the kind of, landlords, both corporate landlords, but also landlords like HMOs, that are kind of ripping off people. And I think there's a real palpable sense that people are being ripped off in this country, whether it's utilities, whether it's landlords, whether it's just really anything. And I think that does form the basis for a kind of more ambitious politics, that sense like things aren't working, people are being ripped off, and that requires actually deep structural reform. And I think it does it's not all about privatization, but if you think about, I think one of the debates, and I think you've had some of the advocates on the podcast before, but I think, a fundamental question facing us is how we rebuild Britain, how we build houses, infrastructure, energy, on and on the list goes. And the consequence of that is rebuilding economic security for ordinary people. And a lot of the focus has been on planning, planning reform. And it's absolutely true that there are elements of the planning system which need reform and which, unnecessarily block things. But actually the fundamental problem is privatisation. I think you had the now pensions minister, Torsten Bell, really smart, able guy who wrote an interesting book. And in that book, he talks about and we haven't built any reservoirs since the early 90s, and that's all about the planning system. But there's another P word, privatisation, because we privatised the water system in 1989 in England, and the logic flipped overnight. So privatisation creates a logic where instead of asset building, you focus on asset sweating. So, you say, well, we've got the reservoirs, why build more? We'll just jack up prices, sweat the asset, and it shifts from real world engineering. So you can see, we talked about nuclear at the beginning. The nuclear fleet in Britain was built under public ownership. It was built, and much of the grid was built. This is a public enterprise, but we switched from real world engineering to financial engineering. So you see like tens of billions of pounds being extracted from bill payers to shareholders or bondholders in the water industry, in the energy industry. And so we have to grapple with what are those logics that privatization imparts around underinvestment, around the prioritization of shareholders, not the public, around bureaucratic mess where you have regulators like Ofwat who regulate the water industry, or Ofgem who do the energy sector, who are being gamed by the private companies themselves. The sort of fragility of the balance sheets of these companies. They're so indebted now that many of them can't undertake the large scale investment. The games they play to sweat their assets, so they underinvest to reduce their profit margins. So there are all these logics that mean even if we reform the planning system, that in and of itself won't be enough. It might be an improvement, but it won't be enough to address this fundamental problem that we have set up in our energy sector, in our water sector, and in our infrastructure sector, a set of incentives, logics and behaviours that chronically underinvest and reward private owners, not the public. And that is coming back to bite us now.
Should we talk about the water sector, which you mentioned there? Because the government have said that to take the failing water companies into public ownership would cost, I think, £99 billion is the figure that the government have said. Commonwealth have released a report to say that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and nationalisation could be a lot cheaper than that. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, I think, don't really need to stress it, but it's important to start with saying just what a mess the water industry is in. Bills are going up and up, almost as quickly as sewage is going into our rivers and waterways. We have got huge investment sort of needs to repair the system, and yet we look backwards and we see sort of £80 billion worth of dividends extracted and huge amounts extracted for bondholders in the sector. And so we've got this sort of bizarre system where, as I mentioned, we built infrastructure and reservoirs, and it's not to say public ownership was always perfect, but we did build under public ownership, and this current model sweats assets and extracts value, and the waterways of England pay the price, as do sort of customers. And that you're not going to fix that unless you tackle that fundamental problem of who owns and uses assets, and privatisation changes the logic in a negative way. Then you say, okay, well, how much does that cost to change that? And it's worth noting, how unusual England is. And it's England because Wales and Scotland have got different approaches.
I ask myself this every day, how unusual England is.
I mean, England is it's its own country. The figure of 90 odd billion was generated by a report that was paid for by a number of water companies, which may or may not have generated the outcome as suggested. But essentially what they used was a regulated capital value measure, which is, without going into the details, it's kind of taking the value at privatisation and kind of like a set of figures. But if we sort of consider Thames Water, KKR, which is a US private equity giant, termed in the 90s the barbarians at the gate because of their kind of asset stripping. They've kind of pioneered that model. They're not people who will sort of just offer money and overpay. They offered 4 billion for Thames Water, whereas the regulated capital value suggested it would be about 20 billion. So you can kind of see they're all automatically that the market value is actually much lower. But then our argument is that actually, KKR sort of pulled out actually because they're like, well, there are too many onerous environmental regulations and too many political demands, such as clean water, being placed on us. So they pulled out. But sort of what we argued in this paper was that actually the industry itself is in significant breach of statutory duties around sort of sewage discharge, clean water, so on and so forth, and that their license can therefore be challenged and revoked. if that sort of application to revoke their license is granted by the courts, and then the companies can be placed into what is called special administration regime, and that would decide how much the assets are sort of valued before being transferred to a public entity. And the argument by a sort of legal specialist, Dr. Ewan McGaughey, who is based at King's College and sort of specialist in this, is that that's kind of close to zero, because actually both the scale of the breaches of these companies and the sort of value already extracted is so significant that actually it shouldn't be 4 billion, it should be close to zero, and those assets should be transferred over. And there's a paper on Commonwealth's website which goes through the details on that. But it's a pretty striking argument, and it's something that we've done before with Network Rail, when that was put into a special administration regime and then transferred to a publicly owned entity for sort of zero cost. And it may be that that would also be argued in court. But the idea that we'd have to pay 90 billion is, I think, clearly just not true. Clearly not true. And I think the government has much more leverage in this, because not least these companies are barely solvent, Thames Water in particular. And it's only because they have this monopoly, which they can charge a customer base which doesn't have any choice if you live in the kind of area served by Thames Water, that keeps it just about viable. But 90% of the world's water industry is in public hands. We are very unusual, and it really is time to end this experiment that has manifestly failed.
Why do you think bandying around a number like 99 billion when asked why do we not just privatize the system sounds to me like they're trying to scare the public into not taking it back into public ownership. Why would a left-wing government want to kind of turn the public off taking something back as a national asset?
I've got 99 billion problems, but public ownership is so I think it's a good question. I think look, there's no denying that there's a sort of complexity to so there hasn't been a publicly run water company for a while, and in a way, it's like, just leave it in private hands. But I think the second thing is, I think they would, sort of the Labour government certainly say like, oh well, there's a risk that this adds to public debt and would sort of potentially breach our fiscal rules around sort of debt to GDP figures and so on and so forth. But the special administration regime would take these assets without debt, because there'd be a sort of haircut for the sort of bondholders and shareholders. So that, and then sort of all future investment would be lower, which goes back to that point about the energy sector. Like public investment into water infrastructure would be significantly lower. So to take an example, Thames Water applied for an emergency loan of £3 billion, which was secured from sort of set of Wall Street financiers and bankers, in which the interest rate was around about 9.75%, not quite sure but around 9%, and will cost about 800 million in interest payments over 3 years. A gilt survey, the UK issuing a sort of equivalent bond and then investing it, is around 4.75%. So there's a sort of big spread, and that would translate into lower bills, because you're just investing, you're borrowing at low rates, investing, and that will ultimately have to be paid for by higher bills if you choose to privately finance investment, which is the path we're going down. So we're actively choosing higher bills. But there is the politics of debt is complicated. Politics of like public management of public companies is not something we've run down state capacity. So there is the legitimate questions like how, but in a way you could just say like just run it as it is, but don't pay shareholders, don't extract that. Just that all bills go towards investment. Just doing that in and of itself would suddenly give you a lot more money to play with and help either bring down bills or mean even if bills go up, which they might have to go up because of the wreckage of the last 20 to 30 years and its accumulation. Even if bills go up, we know that they would be going directly to invest in improving infrastructure rather than being siphoned off to sort of shareholders, often sort of large-scale international investors. So there's a whole set of benefits. And I think the Cunliffe review, which is the government review into the water industry, kind of ruled out public ownership. But I think if Thames Water is forced further and further down the track, I think it will end up, my guess would be it would end up in special administration regardless. And you'd think there'd be political benefit like Farage is saying, to saying, hold on a second, this is a racket, it's not working, the public are being held over a barrel, we're going to end this. The Labour government is going to stand up on behalf of people and say enough, okay, enough, we've had enough and we're going to change it. So I think that would be politically a better way of doing it than kind of crabbing their way through gritted teeth and ending up in a kind of crisis anyway where they have to act, like in Scunthorpe. And I think that proactive sense of a Labour government standing up and for and on behalf of working people, not just in kind of investing in housing and whatnot, which I think is really important. And I think, to their credit, I think they will do a bit more of that in the spending review. But in kind of day-to-day sense where people feel they're being ripped off, where they feel like, hold on a second, like my bills have gone up. How much? The Thames Water in a parliamentary committee, one of their executives said, like, oh yes, we need to pay bonuses to retain our most precious resource, which is
shareholders.
Senior management, in fact. Yeah. So it wasn't like the public, it wasn't water, like literally the most precious resource. It was kind of senior management, which just kind of shows I think the public, we are completely through the looking glass here.
Yeah.
And someone who says, with a clear plan, not just a kind of like, oh, nationalise with no plan, but a clear sense like, how would you do this? How would it benefit the public? How would it fix the water system? But it's willing to stand up and say enough, I think, would gain political traction for them.
It seems mad that within the UK, where there is nations with public ownership, alternative forms of ownership of water, that it's not that radical a thing to do. We already have it within the UK. It does feel slightly strange that there's this timidity from England to not follow suit.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I think we've got literally a live experiment where Scotland has a public water system and it's got higher investment, better water quality, lower bills, and that would seem a better outcome than what we have in the UK with kind of sort of record sewage discharge, rising bills, very large indebtedness. So I think that does speak to exactly like it's strange. I think there are some deeper logics around not wanting to scare the horses, and therefore to attract investment, and I think wanting to sort of project a sort of stable economic strategy. But I think sometimes stability is destabilizing. It is actually it generates more convulsions, more instability through inaction, and in fairness, there's not quite inaction. There have been steps here and there, but it's the failure to address this fundamental problem will mean we're sort of dancing on top of a volcano, and eventually I think it's going to blow, and there will have to be action to step in to support the water industry at some point. And I think a more comprehensive plan, which has very significant public support, would be a better political sort of strategy than this inaction as its own form of instability.
Is there a handbook for this kind of thing? Like, I mean, we've talked about nuclear and water in specific, but I mean, most recently, like British Steel has gone into semi-public ownership. You've got kind of the running debate on transport, trains. It seems renationalisation is one of the most obvious things that a government can do to make people's lives better on a day-to-day practical basis. Outside of radical communist revolution, are there countries that have gone on this kind of mass renationalization project and it's kind of been a demonstration of something good?
Yes, I think a couple of things. One, the UK is unusual. It was a real pioneer of privatisation in terms of the sort of scale and value. And so if you look at continental Europe or indeed parts of the US and obviously China in different ways, if you look at energy, transport infrastructure, housing, water, some of these fundamentals, the essentials we all need to live, the UK is unusual in the extent to which we have privatised, financialised and marketised those basic fundamental essentials and utilities. So you could kind of look in a lot of places say, oh, this is better. Second, which stresses again, like this is normal. You don't need a communist revolution and socialization of the economy to do this at scale. You just need a sort of clear-eyed plan of the benefits. The second thing is, I think often, quite rightly, the benefits of fairness are stressed around public ownership. Like, it's unfair that our bills are going up to pay for rising shareholder payouts or to pay for rising corporate indebtedness. That seems fundamentally unfair. I've got no choice but to use Thames Water or to, use the train sort of operating companies' equipment to get to work, whatever it might be. And so that's just a basic unfairness. But actually, this sort of argument, I think, is functional at its core. Actually, to go back to what I said earlier about the energy sector, like, public ownership gives you a set of tools and a set of advantages around coherence of investment, certainty of investment, and lower cost of capital, which translates to lower bills, to organize the large-scale investment we need to do to rebuild energy, to sort of scale affordable housing, and to rebuild our sort of wider infrastructure in this country. So it's just basically a toolkit. It's just a functional toolkit that gives you more flexibility. The third thing is, like, we shouldn't be naive. Public ownership, just because they've renationalized the trains isn't in and of itself a panacea. It won't in and of itself make things automatically better. What it does is it's a sort of content that enables a more flexible form. In other words, privatized utilities, they have got a single logic: profit maximization, shareholder value. Whereas public ownership, you could do that. You mentioned earlier, you've got sort of foreign state-owned enterprises that operate trains in the UK that run as profit maximizing entities in the UK. So you could do that, but the critical thing is public ownership allows you to have the flexibility to say, actually, no, our priority right now is not maximizing profits, it's building homes. Our priority right now is not, like, how can we squeeze the last drop from X? It's how can we build more, clean energy. So it gives you that sort of institutional flexibility to prioritize different social, economic, environmental objectives. So in a way, that's part of the sort of, I guess, it's deeply political, because it's saying, like, how do we want to live together? What do we want to prioritize? What are the values that we should organize our society around, rather than just like there's a monocausal logic, which is profit maximization, and just let the system go? It's actually saying, like, how do we want to live together? How do we organize these fundamental sectors, energy, transport, sort of water? Like, how do we do that? Who do we prioritize? How do we embed different values, ethics, ways of living together into those systems? So it's a deeply political thing, and in a kind of depoliticized economic system that is quite sort of like scary. But I think that is the fundamental thing. Like, how do we want to live together?
Seems so simple and so obvious when you when you talk about it, that it's like, yeah, it seems insane that we've ended up where we are. Is there anything else that you guys would like to add?
I'm
No?
happy.
Happy to end it? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
We will see you guys in the subreddit.
Bye.